So welcome to our October Linguistics Colloquium. I'm glad to see so many of you joining us today, and I hope that you've all been staying safe and healthy. As you know, the virus is spreading very quickly right now, so please remember, if you have any symptoms at all, stay home and get well. Don't come to campus or go anywhere else where you risk getting someone else sick, okay? Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for today. Dr. David Beard is an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Languages, Linguistics, and Intercultural Communication at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which is also known as UMBC. Before joining UMBC in 2019, he was an assistant professor at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And there he worked in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese from 2015 until 2019. Incidentally, his time in Ohio overlapped with my own, and our paths actually did cross in 2017, not in Ohio, but at the Kentucky Foreign Languages Conference at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. At that conference, he and his students had been scheduled to present their research in the same session that my students and I were also scheduled to present in, on actually a very similar topic. So he and I met then and got to know each other fairly well back then. Dr. Beard has a PhD in Hispanic linguistics from UC Davis, where his dissertation investigated bilingual word recognition involving cognates. Since then, he's published several papers on bilingualism, second language acquisition, and language pedagogy, focusing particularly on orthographic and phonological effects in visual word recognition. Of particular note is that Dr. Beard was invited to give a plenary speech last year at the APEC conference in Quebec, Canada. We are fortunate to have him speaking to us today. He'll be speaking about his recent research on L2 influence on L3 word recognition. And the title of his talk is, I Know Spanish, Which Romance Language Should I Learn Next? So let's give Dr. Beard a warm welcome, maybe in the form of a virtual applause or a thumbs up. Dr. Beard, the time is now yours.
All right, good afternoon to everyone. Can I get a quick thumbs up, just that you can hear me still? Oh, fantastic. Why don't I see if I can actually use technology today, share my screen with you, and then I'll say a few words and then begin our presentation today. Okay. So how are we looking okay here? Are we seeing the title screen to the presentation?
Yes, I am.
Oh, that's outstanding. I actually teach classes on language and technology, but that doesn't actually mean that it's going to work for me. So again, good afternoon to everyone. First and foremost, I just want to thank you very much for, I want to thank Scott Jarvis for inviting me to give this talk. And I want to just thank all of you for tuning in, signing in from your homes or wherever you may be. This pandemic has certainly taken a toll on us, sometimes maybe more than others. But if how our students are doing this semester is any reflection of the general population, we're pretty stressed, anxiety levels are high, our workloads in our classes are high, and we're just really doing our best, I think, to survive. So just thank you all very much for coming to this talk. I really do appreciate it, and I'm very grateful to be able to present to you today. Like I said, like Scott said, my name is David Beard. You can call me David or whatever rolls off the tongue easiest. No big qualms there. why don't we jump into this presentation and see if I can work this technology here. All right, so what I'm going to present today, I know Spanish. Which Romance language should I learn next? L2 influence on L3 word recognition. I have a lot to say about this project. Anything from the participants to the researchers to the topic at hand. As you can see, we actually published preliminary results on this when we looked at differences between Portuguese and Italian in relation to Spanish. And we did this at the proceedings of the conference in the International Conference on the Mental Lexicon. It's a really nice conference. It's held every other year and somewhere in Canada. And it's generally computational linguistics, psycholinguistics, and neurolinguistics that are those fields coming together to look at the lexicon. So it's quite an interesting conference, but they also have opportunities for junior researchers to publish, as well as senior researchers to publish too. So you might have read this very brief article we put together as part of the proceedings. If you did, that's great. If not, no worries. What I'm going to present on today actually is that project continued. So we've taken that project and we are now looking at French as well as Romanian. And so we're asking ourselves, hey, if I know Spanish, which Romance language should I learn next? I have a choice of 4 now. Before I hop into the content of my talk, I wanted to provide my contact info. Again, my name is David Beard. You can see where I'm at. There's my email, my Twitter handle, as well as my phone. I do this at the beginning of every semester with my students, and I'm happy to do it with all of you here. If you think that I might be able to be of help in some way because of the topics I'm investigating, because of something that I'm doing today, just please feel free to contact me. I want to do my best to mentor junior scholars as much as I can. I'm still kind of one myself, but that's important to me. We have some time after this talk just to chat, but in case you're not able to hang out, here's the info to get a hold of me, okay? So let's see what we're looking into. So a little bit of a preface. What I'm interested in here is using pre-existing knowledge to develop new skills. This is not something new. It's been done in cognitive psychology for a long time, looking at the difference between beginners and experts. And it looks like beginners and experts, when they look at the same stimulus, they process it in a different way. And applying this to language and learning a second language, we already have knowledge of a first language. This is a truism. But what that first language does with, or how that first language affects the acquisition or our development of a second language, that's interesting to me. If you look at ACTFL, if you think about language pedagogy and developing second language proficiency, they have proficiency guidelines, but they also have specific groups in which they've put languages into, and they estimate based on, if you know English, it'll take you X amount of months, hours, etc., to acquire group 1, and then of course it's going to be more hours for group 2. And so what I'm getting at here is it seems that the first language we have has effects on the second language we want to learn. And then maybe the second language we learn also has an effect on the third language we want to learn. Nothing too magnanimous or novel, but I just want to kind of set this up. I'm an applied linguist, so you can see kind of my ideas, and what I'm doing is conceptualizing language very much in the sense of those objects that we name, like English, Spanish, and without getting into any theoretical linguistics, this would be considered an externalist approach as opposed to like an internalist approach, okay? So I don't know if I'm lazy. I try to be efficient, but I also, I want to use all the resources I have at hand to acquire whatever new information comes my way. So we can ask ourselves, if you want to learn Spanish, let's say you know English, what words can you already recognize? We can start at the top, and these are all words actually in Spanish. So let's just look at them, right? And it works well that we're looking at the screen. The actual medium we're working in here is visual word recognition. So if things are done in the auditory realm, we might expect different results. The first word here, animal, then we have papel, efecto, actriz, árbol. And I think you probably were able to either guess or kind of already know that the first word was animal in English, the second word was paper, the third word was effect, the fourth word, maybe, it's getting a little bit more opaque, it's less transparent. It's actress, right? And then the last one, we actually can't use the form there at all to get to the word tree in English, but maybe you took Latin and you know that, or you can think of maybe, or your lexical richness is high, and you're thinking of arboretum and other words that begin with arbor, something like that, right? So what I'm kind of getting at, can we use orthography as a way into a language? I work in language learning and language teaching. So I work with teachers a lot, and they're interested in providing the best materials they can to their students, right? And I'm also interested in how we learn, just generally, and specifically related to language. So it's kind of a win-win situation. What can these overlapping patterns tell us about learning something? And then, of course, down the line, teaching that something. The inspiration for this project actually came over the summer. I've taught history of the Spanish language several times. We teach this class in Spanish, and the external history in which we talk about cultural and social changes throughout, 2,500 years. It's a lot of history, but it's pretty intuitive and or accessible. The internal part of the history, though, dealing with say phonetic changes and say phonetic changes from Latin forward, right? Looking at that. Students always have a part on the second exam in which they get a word in Latin. They need to, based on the rules they've learned, apply those rules and derive a word in Spanish. Students are like notoriously really, really bad at this. I was really, really bad at this when I first started doing this as a student. And I actually don't think it's just that we're a second language learners of Spanish. I took a course, History of the Spanish Language, at the University of Salamanca in Spain with Spaniards. And this is the most failed course in that department for that semester. It's a guarantee. So why is that though, right? Like, depending on who you ask, like Latin is Spanish, right? I mean, it's Latin 2,000 years later, but what happened here? So theoretically, everything we're looking at here are cognates, and the idea with cognates, words that are translations of one another, and they also share some sort of orthographic or phonological overlap. They can also have the same root, right? Man, they just changed like so much from Latin to Spanish that maybe if we looked at like each change, like take the first example, platea from Latin. And the idea is like it started to change and it went from platea to platia, plaza, and then eventually plaza or plaza, right? But students will usually guess plata means silver. I would guess though that when these changes were actually taking place, right? That the speakers of platea, when they started hearing platia, that wasn't too big of a shift. It was only changing not the entire word, but just a small portion of it. But then by the time when we jump several steps forward, it seems rather opaque. So it looks like we can use orthography to get into languages. We're going to talk about cognates and why they're important. But here we have different types of cognates. Some of them are more easily recognizable, like number 3, viña, like a vine, for instance, right? But anyways, what I'm looking at here is as a learner, you come across a lot of words, and some of these words look similar to other words, some look very different. And what's it like processing these words, right? So couldn't get out of the presentation, without doing a meme. So with this character D in this series, It's Sunny in Philadelphia, she's reading instructions in Spanish, and she's about to inject her brother with Botox. And she says, yeah, but if you know Latin, you know like 3 languages. And he follows up by saying, and you don't know Latin, right? And she says, no, but, and the inspiration for this project came from seeing students struggling to process words from Latin into Spanish, even though they were kind of cognates. And then also that you can look in pop culture, and there's a lot of references that Latin connects you to a lot of other languages. There's an episode of The Simpsons in which Homer actually, he gets a computer and the internet, and Homer's very dangerous with both of those things. He starts a blog and he says that Spanish and Italian are the same language. They're not, but there's a reason why we were willing to believe that and not Spanish and Mandarin or Spanish and German, for instance. There's sort of a cultural perception that there are similarities there between these languages. So if there are similarities between these languages, how do these languages interact when we learn another language, right? When we know a first language and we learn a second language. Or in this case, if we know 2 languages and we're interested in learning a third, what kind of advantages do we have at the onset of that, right? So for years, people talked about, I think like Weinreich in 1953, talked about interference. Other people talked about transfer, and then eventually influence. And if you really want to know about this topic, this is just one book, Cross-Linguistic Influence in Language and Cognition. This is probably the best picture I've ever seen in my life. And I just want to compliment Scott and also congratulate him. I think he was awarded an honorary doctorate here. And that is just, wow, that's really admirable, and that's amazing. You guys have access to a great scholar and a very knowledgeable person of these topics. I don't think it takes too much convincing then to understand that languages that we know relate to one another somehow in the head, okay? Without making any strong claims. Why are we even investigating vocabulary? Just real quick, if I'm learning another language, how many words do I need to know? That's a pretty important thing. So Robert Blake and Yves Isaac, they speak about this in learning vocabulary in a second language. They talk about word frequency, collocations, and cognates being kind of 3 types of words or ideas when we're learning vocabulary to pay attention to. So first and foremost, they say like word frequency is big, because if we know, well, we need to know about 3,000 to 8,000 words. We need word families, right, like lemmas, to read independently in a language. So it would really behoove us to know the most frequent words when we're acquiring a new language. That helps for sure. Collocations help as well, but I won't speak about them today. And then cognates also help. So the idea here being, if you have a language with more cognates, that's going to facilitate learning in some way. There's a lot of reasons to pick cognates. I mean, there's a ton. Just a couple to pick. Between English and Spanish, working with students that are learning Spanish as a second language, or heritage speakers that are working in English, for instance, about 1/3 of the words in academic texts, so working with students to acquire academic competencies, those are English-Spanish cognates. And there are false cognates too, but this only makes up about 6 or 7% of the words. This is pretty significant, right? So teachers have known for years that we can use cognates to facilitate learning. We look at a word like we did animal or papel or efecto before. We're like, oh yeah, I think I kind of know that, right? And then really cool, patients, bilingual aphasics that have undergone therapy tend to recollect cognates more than non-cognates. So if we know two languages and they have words that overlap, it seems that those words are stored kind of in a special way, or maybe processed in a special way. This is relevant to psycholinguistics because research about the lexicon in bilinguals, for the last couple of decades, at least that I can tell, has been trying to address whether we can kind of activate both languages when we hear a signal, or whether one language is kind of suppressed when we get input, right? You can call it non-selective or selective access. And the idea with selective or non-selective access is that I can select my access. So I get the input signal and there's kind of a one processing, one path basically from that input signal to one specific language. And then the non-selective understanding would just be that I get the input signal and maybe both languages are competing to tell me what that signal means, right? And in competing, they interact in some way, making the access more or less non-selective until like the last stage in which you make a decision, right? And you say it was English or it was Spanish, something like that. As best as I can tell though, the discussion right now isn't really saying like, hey, can bilinguals turn off a language? It's basically saying, hey, look at what the bilingual's doing. Like, let's look at the task that we're performing. If we're writing, if we're reading, what is the content of the input? And that might affect whether we have selective or non-selective access based on certain task demands. And then maybe we can just kind of zoom in or zoom out, right, of these languages. Either way, though, they're connected, right? So I did mention, but this is François Gauchot, well-known researcher in psycholinguistics, quite famous book, The Psycholinguistics of Bilingualism, in which he addresses everything I just mentioned, but in much more detail and of course, much more cogently. We're gonna be looking at reaction times in this study. So I'm gonna show you some results that are from an experiment we did. And so just a few words about reaction times if you're not used to looking at them, or if you're not used to thinking about how you could construct an experiment with reaction times. It's pretty simple. This is coming out of, well, earlier in physiology in the late 19th century, but really in cognitive psychology in the 20th century, this is used a lot, right? So we're thinking that reaction times reflect some sort of processing. Simple tasks correlate with short reaction times, and complex tasks correlate with long reaction times. They can put people in a lab and time your reaction time to solve mathematical equations. As you increase the complexity of the mathematical equation, it'll take you longer. Cognitive psychologists might be interested if that's like a linear function or a curvilinear function or something cool like that. But I just want us to think about reaction times as though if it takes us a little bit longer, there's a little bit more processing involved, okay? We can see that with language in example B. So if you prime someone with nurse and then gave them a target nurse, right? So you showed them the word nurse, then the next word you showed them was nurse, and you had them react as soon as they saw the second word. This is the second, once they saw the target nurse, we would expect a quick reaction in relation to number 2, in which you have nurse and doctor. Now we still have semantic association, right? Nurse will prime doctor, but we don't have the exact identity prime that we had in number 1. And then number 3, nurse and pasta, there's not a specific semantic association between nurse and pasta. I think I was just hungry when I came up with that example. And the idea here is that it's a little bit more complex. The prime has you access nurse, and then you're given the target pasta. And maybe you need to back out of the lexical entry nurse and then activate pasta, right? So it's going to take you a little bit more time. So again, the inspiration for this study kind of came from history of the Spanish language and historical linguistics. And I'm combining some work that was done in historical linguistics with my own work, which is on language processing, psycholinguistic-esque, I guess. And this is a chart of lexical similarity. So lexical similarity, historical linguists have used this for years to assess the similarity between two languages, to see if they're the part of the same language family, part of the same variety, are the same language, etc. Right? You can think of getting like a Swattish list of like 200 very common words, things like hand, tree, mouth. I don't know. There's a list though, and when you compare that across languages, look at the form overlap. And that's what historical linguists using the comparative method had done for years. And so you can go to like Ethnologue, Wikipedia, and check a chart on lexical similarity. And it's based on orthography, right? They don't have access to the way this sounds. They just got documents and they're reviewing things. This is cool. So we actually began hypothesizing based on these values. So we thought like, all right, if we have to compare languages and compare lexicons, it looks like Portuguese has a overlap of 0.89, with the idea that 89% of the lexical items in Portuguese are shared with Spanish. 82% of Italian is shared with Spanish, 75% of French, about 30% of English, but this is not from Ethnologue. It's from a previous citation I had with the benefit of Cognates. And then about 71% of the lexicon in Romanian is shared with Spanish. So we thought, ooh, well, if cognates work to facilitate, there's even a cognate facilitation effect in psycholinguistics, CFE. If that works, all we got to do is like align these measures and they should correlate. It's going to work. So that's kind of what we thought, right? But there's more to it. One quick sec. So remember I talked about types of cognates. So we looked at Latin and we looked at words like vinea, which will give something like viña in Spanish, in comparison to other words like platea, which gives plaza, but it's less transparent, right? Well, if we're dealing with types of cognates only in one language, they're looking at Spanish, right? I imagine that cognates might behave differently between languages. So if I think about Spanish and I look at cognates in Portuguese, or I look at cognates in French, maybe there's like more overlap with Portuguese than there is with French or something like that. And we need a way to quantify this. We used what's called a Levenshtein Distance, and it's just a metric to assess the difference between two strings of characters. It was constructed in 1965, I think, by Vladimir Levenshtein, this computer scientist, and he wanted to measure the distance between exactly this, two strings of characters. So we can see in example A, they go from rain to shine, right? And to do that, they make three changes. They make two substitutions, we see in blue, and they make one insertion, we see in green. So then we would assign that a number, and it would be Levenshtein distance of 3. We see in example C that there's going to be 4 edits that are made, and so there's a Levenshtein distance of 4. And again, what we're trying to get at is there's a correlation between reaction time and the perceived similarity of the target. So if the target's is perceived to be less similar, the reaction time should increase. It would be a longer reaction time. How did we do this? So let me just check in real fast on Zoom to see how we're doing. Make sure my connection hasn't failed. Everyone seems to still be there. All right, continuing on. How did we do this? So this is a methodology within, I'd say within psycholinguistics, pretty common one. Let's start off with the participants. Then we'll talk about the materials we used, and then we'll walk you through the procedure, okay? So we had 90 participants in total, mean age of 20 years. First language is English. They have no experience with learning other languages besides Spanish. Spanish is not spoken at home, and undergraduate students majoring or minoring in Spanish, and they're currently enrolled in a Spanish class where Spanish is spoken. These are students in upper division classes. So it's not that they're Spanish classes, but they are content classes in which they might be reading literature or doing linguistics with me, and we'll be doing that in Spanish. Their second language is Spanish. They have a proficiency level of intermediate, which is a pretty wide proficiency level, but still. And participants, they were paid to complete these experiments. So, all right. Materials we used. So we used a couple desktop computers, the software ePrime 3.0, which lets us set up and design experiments and then implement them. It gives us an output, and then we can process that with a statistical analysis, right? And a Chronos button box. These are cool little boxes that have just buttons on them, and they're very precise in recording reaction times to the millisecond. This is really important because all of the work we're doing here is happening in fractions of a second. So you can think about the scale that we're working on. We had 60 words total, 30 cognates to the Spanish primes in French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, 30 non-cognates to the Spanish primes in French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. None of the words are cognates with English. This is important because we want to know the effect of Spanish on learning their third language, not specifically English, right? So we had to actually eliminate any overlap we had with English. And the word list is controlled for frequency and word length. They're all floating around 20, I think the frequency per million is like around 20 words. Anyways, to give you an example of the words they saw, here's one sample of a non-cognate. So think about 60 words, right, in Spanish. 30 of them are cognates, 30 are non-cognates, and those serve as primes. And then there'll be a target in the corresponding language. So we have the prime, like the non-cognate, like basura, and then the non-cognates in each of the languages. And then we have cognate tristeza, and then the cognates across. We actually saw tristeza earlier, not sadness, but just the word, because we got tristitia, right, from Latin. So this is, I guess if we included Latin in here too, just for fun, but we didn't. Okay, so what's the full procedure? As a participant, you would come to the lab. You're given 5 minutes to study vocabulary. So you get a list of 60 words in Spanish, 30 cognates, 30 non-cognates, and their translation in one of the languages. You're just randomly assigned to one language when you come into the lab. So it's not that participants complete the same task in 4 languages, but that you come in and you complete the task only in Portuguese or only in Italian. So you're getting Spanish primes no matter what, but the targets are gonna change here. So complete a numerical string memory test. So after you studied for 5 minutes, we had you do a visual digit span test. Then you perform the translation recognition task, which I'll explain in the next slide. And that's our main experiment we're looking at. You completed an end-back test next, and then you did a production task. What we did was just give you the, we gave you a list of the words in Spanish, and you needed to translate them, all 60 of them, into the target language. You can imagine this is a much more difficult task than just the comprehension task we asked participants to perform. The real thing we're interested in here, guys, is the translation recognition task. So we thought working memory, if you could remember a lot of items at once, that also might help you perform well on the translation recognition task, right? You get a list of words, you can remember those words better than I can because I just can only remember a few items at once. That makes sense, but none of those correlated. So the end-back test and the visual digit span, they're not significant covariates in the model at all. And then they just kind of worked to get people to think about something else in the meantime, right? So they got the word list, they did something else, which they were very involved in, and then they got the main task, translation recognition, that we're interested in. The vocabulary task, that one is really just to correlate with the translation recognition task. So what is the translation recognition task? So again, think about completing this experiment yourself, right? So you would be sitting at a computer, you would have a button box in front of you, and you only have 2 buttons. one button on the left and one button on the right. And you're going to see a fixation cross we see on the upper right corner of the screen here for 500 milliseconds. It's just like a heads up, like, hey, something's coming, pay attention. And then you get the prime in Spanish. So one of those 60 words, right, is what you're going to get. And then you get that for half a second. And then you get the target screen, and you have 2 words in Portuguese. One of them is a translation of the Spanish prime, and the other one is not. And you need to respond as quickly and accurately as possible. And again, you have a left button and a right button, and that corresponds with the word on the left side of the screen. You'll press the left button, and a word on the right side of the screen, you'll press the right button, if that's the correct translation of the Spanish prime you just saw. Again, it's called translation recognition task. And there are various controls we implemented to ensure that we would not get results with new effects that we didn't want to measure, I guess. So again, reaction times and accuracy are measured. I can go back into this, but this is just a lot of math about balancing everything. And it's pretty typical in, I think, psycholinguistic experiments at least. Okay, so a word of caution. We're going on to the results now. These are preliminary. What I did was look at the data, and I removed data points that I knew were outliers on the low end, right? So when we look at reaction times, think about this. Like if you get a word on the screen, it takes you time to process that word. It has to go, it has to hit your retina, go through the optic nerve into the thalamus. It's projected to the visual cortex. It goes through various areas in the visual cortex here in the occipital lobe before it makes its way lateralized over to the left into some word recognition area, right? So if you're getting a response of like 5 milliseconds or whatnot, that seems impossible. It usually takes about 200 milliseconds for us to even recognize and be able to react, meaning execute a motor function. So any responses under 250 milliseconds in this case, we just eliminated. Well, I'm saying this because there's still some outliers in the upper end. So I think when I look at each one of those individually by subject and by word that we looked at, by item, the results might look a little bit different. Hopefully it'll just be cleaner, but let's take a look. So what research questions were we getting at? There's 4 that we're really interested in. Is there a difference in reaction time between languages? So you get the prime in Spanish, right? And then you get the target in one of 4 languages. Is there a difference in reaction time between these languages? 2, is there a difference in reaction time between word types? So you can think about cognates and non-cognates. Remember, half the words were cognates, half were non-cognates. And so we know about the cognate facilitation effect. Does that occur here? Okay. Research question number 3, is there a difference in reaction time between cognates across languages? So if we look at reaction times only to the cognates, right? So we have the 4 languages, but only the cognates in those 4 languages. Do we notice a difference in reaction time between those? And if we do, like, why is that? I guess spoiler alert, but I'm going to pitch something about Levenshtein Distance that I mentioned earlier. And then research question 4, does Levenshtein Distance affect reaction to targets? Remember, I had this idea that lower Levenshtein Distance, like nurse, right, with no edits, that would be a really fast reaction time, a short reaction time. But something with growing a Levenshtein Distance, like we did from animal and animal to paper and papel to effect and effecto to actress and actriz. That goes from 0, 1, 2, 3 across those words we used earlier. All right, let's take a look. Oh, nope, not yet. I guess we wanted to hypothesize. So I've hypothesized that perceived similarity results in faster reaction time. So what we think is going to happen is we're going to have the lowest reaction times in Portuguese, then Italian, then Romanian, then French. Or if you look at the lexical similarity measures, 89% of the lexicon shared, 82%, 71%, 75%. The issue here and why we don't have French ranked above Romanian, because it actually shares more lexical similarity with Spanish, is that we don't think lexical similarity captures orthographic reforms through the centuries. So what we had to do was look at orthographic changes from Latin into each one of these Romance languages, right? And so that's what we hypothesized. That's why we see the shift and we don't rank French higher. So I'm arguing here for another metric. And if we include Levenshtein distance as a predictor of what I'm calling perceived similarity, with reduced Levenshtein distance correlating to a shorter reaction time, then the hypothesis that more similar equals faster reaction time makes more sense. So what we have is the ordering like we had before: Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, French. But instead of associating the lexical similarity measures, what we have here are the Levenshtein distance measures averaged for cognates in each of these languages. So you have 2.2, meaning that Portuguese cognates have an averaged Levenshtein distance between Spanish of 2.2, whereas French on the high end has an average Levenshtein distance of 3.7. Again, this is just the cognates we're looking at here. That's our hypothesis. Let's check it out. All right, so got a little drink of water there and good to go. So research question 1, is there a difference in reaction time between languages? Let's take a look. Well, we have the 4 languages here. I'm looking at French on the left, and it looks like it has an average reaction time. I should actually explain things. I might be moving a little bit fast. I'm sorry. On the y-axis is reaction time, and it's the average reaction time for that language across all observations. So the average reaction time for cognates and non-cognates in French was 1176 milliseconds, right? Or like 1.176 seconds. So to me, is there a difference in reaction time between languages? I mean, if I'm just looking at this in observation, there seems to be a difference between French and the rest of them, but I don't see anything super significant between Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. I put a nova on this thing because the way we form that question, right, kind of yes or no, are there differences, yay or nay? We're kind of forming this question because of years of using an analysis of variance to do our modeling. But I think we can ask a little bit different of a question and get, I hope, more insights. So rather than is there a difference, don't worry, we'll treat that. How does the language of the target affect reaction time? This makes more sense to me. So like, how does the language of the target affect reaction time? Maybe based on the language you get, right, it's going to increase or decrease the reaction time. Okay, so that's research question number 1. What about research question number 2? Is there a difference in reaction time between word types? In other words, condition. So now we're looking at cognates and non-cognates. And again, on the y-axis, we have the reaction time. On the x-axis, we have the condition. And we have cognates in red, non-cognates in blue. This is pretty clear, actually. So if we were to just perform an ANOVA, we would, with some confidence, be able to look at this and say, I don't see error bars overlapping. These look like different distributions to me. I think there's an effect of word type. So I think we're getting a cognate facilitation effect here. But then we can also ask, right, like, how does the word type affect reaction time? So what does it do to reaction time, and how much does it affect reaction time? If we use something called a linear mixed effects model, which I won't explain very much of at all, partly because of time, and I can happily go into explaining what I can after the talk, though. This should yield a better analysis for us because we're taking into account the fixed effects we're looking for, meaning we're looking for language, and we're looking for cognate, meaning condition. And it takes into account the random effects that we just can't help. So we have different subjects, right, that are responding And we also have different words that are being responded to. So maybe we can include those in a model, which ANOVA cannot do. We can only include the fixed effects in ANOVA, and we can account for more of the variance, which is always a cool thing to do in stats. So research question number 1 and 2, what we did was a linear mixed effects model. And to answer research question number 1, is there a difference in reaction time between languages? No. And how do we know this? Well, how do we read these results? Let's take a look here, okay? So we have a table and it shows predictors on the left, and you see the intercept here. Just replace the intercept with language French. So I could have fixed that, but I want us to know that this is sort of like a baseline mean. This is what we would expect, right? And because the software I'm using, R, processes things alphabetical, it just made the baseline mean French. So it shows this. It says, this is the intercept, meaning French. Woo! Oh, got a little bit scared there. This is the intercept, meaning French. And then we have each language down below, the condition, and we're only seeing the non-cognate condition, and then the Levenshtein distance we included in the model. And the estimates here, the next column we're looking at, the idea here is that these are the estimates not on the sample we looked at, but we took the sample of data that we collected and we formed estimates thinking that, hey, in the population, this is what we would expect. And we see something like 973.99. So what that's telling us is we didn't change the metric. This is still in reaction times. And this just says that averaged across French, I would expect a reaction time of 973 or 974 milliseconds. And then what's cool, right, to get at our second research question, how does the word type affect reaction time? We go down language, right, and we see that language Italian minus 126. The idea here is that in relation to this 973, so going from French to Italian, you actually have a shorter reaction time of 126 milliseconds. Going from French to Portuguese, about 156 millisecond boost, and then about 159 millisecond boost going to Romanian. But you can see on the far column on the right, where we have a p-value, we're looking for a p-value of 0.05 or less, and neither of these figures within language meet that. So that's why we answer no to our first research question. And then we look to our second research question about word type. And this is cool, right? So do we have a cognate facilitation effect? Yeah, we do. It looks like for non-cognates, it takes an additional 102 or 103 milliseconds to recognize non-cognates. So if you get a Spanish prime and then your target comes up, if that target is a non-cognate, it's going to take you an additional about 100 milliseconds to recognize it. Yeah, and that's about what I have to say here. Research question 3. Is there a difference in reaction time between cognates across languages? So now we actually ditched the non-cognates and we're only looking at the cognates. We look at 4 bars we have here for each language. But again, this is comparing cognates in French to cognates in Italian to cognates in Portuguese, cognates in Romanian. You can see the reaction times in milliseconds there. And we ask ourselves the ANOVA question, is there a difference? Yeah, I would say yes, between French and the rest of them, but that the rest of them, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, there's no difference, I would assume. How does reaction time to cognates change by language? Well, I want to know that. That's really interesting. So let's take a look. Oh, bonus question, 3.5. Why is there a difference between reaction time to cognates across languages? So now I wanted to bring Levenshtein distance back into it. Remember that we started with Levenshtein distance and we thought that lower Levenshtein distance, shorter reaction time, longer reaction time, that would correlate with a higher Levenshtein distance. So let's take a look at these back and forth, right? So this is cognates and their reaction times. And then the next one here, what we're looking at is just average Levenshtein distance from Spanish. And so we see the lowest Levenshtein Distance at 2.2 for Portuguese. We go and look at the Portuguese reaction times, and they're the lowest. Okay. So Levenshtein Distance is doing something. Question 4, does it do anything? Wow, I anticipated what I was going to say. Amazing. All right, so how does Levenshtein Distance affect reaction to cognates? These are the 2 questions we're working with. Does it affect? Yes, it does. How does it affect? Well, let's check this out. This chart, or this graph here, shows us Levenshtein Distance on the x-axis. Sorry about that. Shows us Levenshtein Distance on the x-axis. And we move from the bottom left, 0 Levenshtein Distance, so 0 edits, no change, identical word. And we go out to the right and we increase Levenshtein Distance. And on the y-axis, we're looking at reaction time again. And so as we go up, we're increasing reaction time. And you guys can see that there's just an increase as we continue to increase in reaction time as we increase Levenshtein Distance, okay? There's that positive correlation. So running, again, a linear mixed effects model on this, in which we look for the fixed effects and we look for the random effects, we include those into the model. Is there a difference in reaction time between cognates? Yes, there is. French cognates are perceived as different from the other 3 languages. How do we know this? We can look up at our chart again. Remember, we have predictors and estimates. So let's look at our estimates, and it's predicting the intercept here, French cognate's going to be 973. And then as we move down, language to Italian. So in Italian cognate, you get a boost of about 160 milliseconds over a French cognate. In Portuguese, you get a boost of about 190 milliseconds over a French cognate. And in Romanian, about 180 milliseconds. We check the right column for p-values, and we see that all of these are significant in relation to the intercept, right? So in relation to French here. And then we look at Levenshtein Distance. We include this in the model to see if it's predicting reaction time. And it looks like as Levenshtein Distance increases, we know that reaction time does too. Our estimates show here 40.52. This is significant. And so I show you on the bottom here, this is just to clarify, research question number 4. Does Levenshtein Distance affect reaction time to cognates? Yeah, reaction time increases about 80 milliseconds for every 1 unit increase in Levenshtein Distance. The unit that I'm working with here, we see in the model, is a half a distance, or a half a Levenshtein Distance. So we would just multiply that by 2, and then that would show us the effect of Levenshtein Distance on reaction time. Not a big question here, but we can ask, is there a difference in reaction time between non-cognates across languages? There kind of shouldn't be. If we designed the experiment well and we had a good set of words, there shouldn't be if everything is equal. But maybe the lexicons themselves, just the words, are actually different. Again, what happens if we look at Levenshtein Distance? This is giving us Levenshtein Distance from the Spanish prime to the target in whatever language they were. So average Levenshtein Distance now for non-cognates here, you can see French still has the highest at like 6.6, and it has the highest reaction time. So Levenshtein Distance is doing something here. It's a pretty coarse measure, I have to say, in terms of edit distances, but it's getting us somewhere, which is cool. Okay, so the results. Which Romance language should I learn next? Okay, if we include Levenshtein Distance as a predictor of perceived similarity, like I said before with our hypothesis, I guess Portuguese, then Italian and Romanian, knowing that there's no difference in processing between those, and then French, knowing that it's going to be a little bit more effort to process French lexical items if you're constantly priming yourself with Spanish. Maybe if you had a word list in Spanish to French, for instance, right? I should say now what I probably should have said before, continuing with the inspirations for this, right? Kind of pop culture along with history of the Spanish language, seeing students learn this material. I've also been asked this question by a lot of students. They come to my office and they ask me like, hey, I put a lot of time in, I know Spanish. Like, I want to learn another language. Which language should I learn next? And I was speaking to someone about this at the Mental Lexicon conference, where we published the first part of the results to the study. And when I was presenting, I finished, and the guy said, the audience member said to me, I think learning another language because it's easy is probably the worst reason to learn that language. And I was like, I totally agree. This is obviously a fun study that we did. We incorporated some kind of heavy machinery, right, with experimental design, statistical analysis, a little bit of computer science. But at the end of the day, I'm an applied linguist, and I want to see what we can kind of do with this stuff. So I can answer students now with some empirical evidence, but I can also, again, emphasize that, hey, probably your interests will lead you to a language to learn, right? So a little bit of discussion, and then I'll close because I've been talking for a while. Why doesn't lexical similarity work with French, right? Remember how we had lexical similarity. French is at 75% of the lexicon is shared with Spanish, and Romanian is at 71%. Why is French, for instance, yielding longer reaction times? I really think it's the orthography. So in psycholinguistics, we can speak about shallow orthographies and deep orthographies. And French is considered a deep orthography in that if you look at the letter to sound correspondence, it's far from one-to-one. And so that actually is causing, I think, us just to take a little bit more time to process that, that information, that input. And then again, if we take our heads out of the lab a little bit and we look at orthographic reforms, right, to see what people have done, what organizations have done throughout time, anything from La Real Academia Española to La Académie Française, like, right, and seeing the effects of that. I know that French orthography has not been reformed in some time, and one of the last reforms, the reform was made more to maintain an etymological understanding, or a Latin-based, or kind of, and it was not based on reducing the depth of the orthography. So why doesn't lexical similarity work with French? I think it's the orthography. And then why do reaction times to Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian reflect similar facilitation to Spanish speakers? I think this is a matter of learned attention. I'll do my best to explain that in one sec. So this is a topic taken up by Nick Ellis and others, but Nick is super productive. I think he publishes like an article a month or something. So the idea here, right, is that we learn to focus our attention on certain structures and patterns, and we end up ignoring others. So the orthographic patterns of these three languages, they correlate more with Spanish and French, is my intuition. And therefore, Spanish speakers do not have to make significant adjustments in processing these orthographies successfully. So if we abstract and we look at the orthographic patterns of each language in relation to French, I assume that the patterns look more similar to someone that knows Spanish. So if I look at Spanish and look at Italian, oh, okay. If I look at Romanian, sure. Portuguese, the same. In French, what do I do? Is kind of the idea. Of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Remember, these are milliseconds we're talking about here. So the idea I have here is that, again, we learn to focus on specific structures. You can think about French speakers learning to hear lexical stress in English or another language. It takes time for someone to hear the difference between record and record, for example. And then there's a really cool study by Nick Ellis and Segarra, I think 2010, they did a follow-up in 2011, and they trained Spanish and Chinese speakers they trained them on Latin. And then they gave them an assessment. And what was super cool here is we know Spanish has a rich morphological system, so does Latin. We know that Chinese doesn't do verbal morphology. They use adverbs and other ways, basically, of talking to us about when things, how things, and where things happen. And so what was super cool is when they measured the how each learner was processing Latin, the Chinese speakers were not actually even paying attention to the ends of words and looking for morphological changes that way. They were actually paying attention to adverbs, and they were looking for these things, and that's how they could tell when the action occurred. And then with respect to tense, which is what they were looking at, the Spanish speakers had no issue looking at the end of Latin words, for instance. So again, we're just kind of focusing ourselves in on certain patterns. And Nick Ellis has used this. It's a bouquet of irises, I think, right? And now backing out from language, we take a look at this object and we think flowers. But if you've seen this object before, if you've seen Nick present on this, he's showing that, well, we're trained to see flowers, but, and he's speaking about implicit and explicit processes here, but he's like, I can give you a little nudge and say, hey, in the top right, do you see Napoleon? There's a green leaf that's his hat. And then if you come down, it's a silhouette profile view, and you can see his nose and chin. And then of course there's like Josephine, I think on the left, for instance, facing us, and also their child that the painter put in here in the center of the picture, kind of down below. So Nick uses this to show that we can actually we can use explicit teaching, right? And at the same time, he uses this to show that when we come to learn a new language, like Portuguese, Romanian, French, we come either with one language or two languages, and all the patterns of processing that those languages have. This has some implications, both in research and educational implications, but I'm running over what I wanted to speak. And so I'm just going to talk about a couple of conclusions, and then I'll end, and hopefully we can have some questions, and I'm happy to discuss this for as long as you would like. Okay, so conclusions. So online language processing accounts, so psycholinguistic accounts, do not necessarily coincide with historical linguistic accounts of lexical similarity. We can use edit distance metrics like Levenshtein Distance to assess differences in processing. There is a cognate facilitation effect, not only from L1 to L2, but L2 to L3. And that's about it, right? We know that there's a little bit of extra processing involved in processing French cognates and the French orthography. But again, these are millisecond differences. And what language should I learn next, regardless of the languages I know? My recommendation would be to pick something that you really like, of course. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and just mute myself now and open it up for any questions or feedback from you. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. David, we really appreciate that very interesting presentation that you've given us, and the interesting research questions that you began with and how you went about it. So I'll go ahead and open up the session to questions. If anyone has any questions, I think you can probably just jump in, but if someone else is talking, go ahead and raise your hand or use the reactions tool to do it virtually, and I'll call on you. Right. Thank you, David. You can write in the chat also. David, maybe I could start by asking a question here. So were the words in the different language, the different target languages that were given, did they all mean the same thing? Right, okay. Because you had used the same Spanish words in every single condition, right? So of course they translated and had the same meaning. One thing I was wondering is if there's some statistical tests that you could run to look at the interaction between the Levenshtein measure, the Levenshtein distance measure, and the target language. So again, as a statistical interaction. Is that something that you've already done?
Scott, thank you so much for the question. Again, thank you all so much for your time and attention. With respect to interactions, the model that you saw for research questions number 3 and onward, let me just scroll back a little bit here. So once we started processing, okay, so let me see, research question. Yeah, so is there a difference in reaction time between cognates across languages? We saw a main effect, right, for Levenshtein Distance and a main effect for each language. It's not really clear like what we mean by language at this point in time, where that's not very well operationalized, right? I ran this for an interaction to see if maybe like Levenshtein Distance gave you more of a boost in certain languages, right? And there was no significant interaction.
Ah, interesting. So that suggests, I mean, if that result is generalizable, then language really doesn't make any difference. It's really more a matter of the Levenshtein distance, right? But I do wonder, though, if you were to do some sort of item analysis, if you would find the effects of other variables, such as maybe the part of speech of the word or other aspects of semantics, things like imageability, you know, like whether the meaning of the word is concrete versus abstract, things like that.
I like both of those. I think part of speech is something that we could include, imageability too. We did our best to just control the word list we had for frequency, because we know frequency drives a lot of frequency explains a lot of variance in reaction time. We looked at word length too, and we didn't go further. We didn't think about imageability. We didn't think about concreteness, for instance. I know those are highly correlated. And in part because the word list we have is rather restricted. So think about, they can't overlap with English at all. They all have to be cognates with 4 languages, and then the other 30 words have to be non-cognates with 4 languages. And that took us a little bit of time. So I'm thinking if we constructed, what would be kind of cool to see is construct a list of cognates and look at the reaction time as a function of Levenshtein distance and a few other edit metrics, basically, or edit distance metrics, to see what type of computations correlate with our behavior. And that would be kind of interesting to me. Yeah.
Thank you. I have one last follow-up question, by the way. I'm also interested in what would happen if you used false cognates. Did you have any false cognates where there's a similarity of form but not meaning?
We did not. The thing is, though, and this is why even the semantics of the target language, the meaning of those words is probably insignificant, because the participants have no experience in that target language. So they should only have experience with the form of it and not the actual meaning.
Right. So what I meant actually is, what if you were to use, let's say, a word in Portuguese that looks like an existing Spanish word, but it means something totally different from what you would expect it to mean? I'm just wondering what sort of reaction time effect you might get in that case.
So let's use something like a word like exquisite, like exquisito in Spanish, right? Which you have like exquisito. It's not exquisite in Portuguese, it's weird, like something like that, kind of strange. Because of the form overlap and the lack of semantic knowledge in the target language of Portuguese, I would expect a fast reaction time to that, and they would use that form, I think, to react. This is kind of what we see, right, with like early second language learners. And I think like Nan Yang, University of Maryland, talked about this a lot, right? So he says we're wrapped up kind of in the orthography and the phonology, and the associations we make are by sound or by written form. whereas a proficient speaker seems to make semantic associations more.
Thank you. Okay, what
Can I
other
ask you,
questions?
Scott, what are your thoughts about that with Portuguese, for instance? I think you have
Oh.
something in mind with like a false cognate. Would you mind, if you don't mind, elaborating on a little bit?
Oh, well, some of the research that I've done that has looked at how well a person is able to recall a word in a foreign language after having seen it only once suggests that similarity of form has a much stronger effect than similarity of meaning, and that even these so-called false cognates were things that you could learn pretty quickly in comparison with non-cognates. I mean, that's what my own research shows, but anyway, we can talk about that later.
Oh, that is cool as hell. So basically this is getting research, I'm getting learners cognates, and then it's saying, hey, since we're kind of wrapped up in the form anyways, why don't we worry about the non-cognates, because you're distracted by them anyways, and then you can learn that set too.
Right, yeah, I mean, that's part of it for sure. So I see that Mateo has a question. Mateo, go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I have kind of two questions related to data. So first of all, do you have any information about the linguistics, as in the science that we study, of the participants? Because as a learner of second languages, I feel that having that background, got me to touch kind of all the languages that I do not speak, but I've seen maybe several times a certain form or something like that. So do you register at all this information?
Oh, that's like a super good question, right? So short answer is yes. Participants came into the lab and they filled out a kind of a pre-experiment questionnaire. And that questionnaire is kind of a reduced version of something called the LEAP Q, which I think is the like language experience and aptitude questionnaire developed by maybe Marion or Spivey, I can't remember, and others, free to get and use. And so it asks a bunch of language background questions like, hey, in a given week, define your language use across, writing and reading, across speaking and listening, and then divide it among, English and Spanish, if those are your two languages. And so we asked participants a bunch of questions. And then we also did our best just to actually control as much before we let participants into the lab, with the idea that if we have beginners look at this, or advanced learners or native speakers, we think that's going to affect the results. It'll affect the reaction time. And this is so important though, because if we're not paying attention to, this is a really good question. It's like, if we're not paying attention to the language background of our participants, I think we can look at a lot of research done in psycholinguistics, like kind of in the 90s, in which there wasn't really a thing. We were just focusing on averages. And by focusing on kind of specific traits, right, that we would expect a learner to have, we can explain more of the variance, more of that dependent variable that we want to explain. Mateo, thank you for the question and the kind words.
Okay, yeah, I thought that it would have been like a important information. So, so the second question, actually two, but still like in the same field. So in one of the slides, I don't think you had numbers, so I cannot tell you which one, but the one in which you actually have a word, and that word was basura. In the Italian translation, you use scarto, but I'm pretty sure that that's not right, because I think that scarto is desecho, while basura should be spazzatura. So probably is not gonna change. I mean, basura is trash, right? Okay. So I'm not super sure that this would change a lot, because from basura to spazzatura, maybe there is the same kind of distance. But I just kind of wanted to point that out, since I've noticed from the translation French. And last thing, with French, do you think, since you talked about, of course, this, I think I can say weird orthography of French, did you think about doing kind of a follow-up experiment by controlling these? So having some words in which the orthography is not as not similar, because at the same time, you talked about the reform in by the Académie Française, and actually in the last one that took place like 3-4 years ago, I was in undergrad, so that time, I think that they actually did a lot of changes to deal with orthography. I remember Onion, that they stopped writing with the G and an N, and they start doing more similar to the pronunciation. And at the same time, I was thinking about Romanian, that probably like you can find a lot of words in which maybe you have a one-to-one kind of correspondence, but with characters that are not typical in Romance languages. So, I mean, did you think about doing some sort of follow-up with the orthography-related information you got?
Okay, Matteo. So, thank you for the follow-up on that word for scarto. I'll look into that.
Yeah,
and
I don't speak Spanish. I should have said that at the beginning. So I base my that I don't speak Spanish. So I base my comment on the translation in French. So maybe
no worries.
It's not true, but just maybe you want to double check.
I mean, this is a good thing to bring up, right? Because looking at word lists that psychologists have used specifically, or psycholinguists have used, I mean, what we're calling a cognate is a cognate in certain word lists, and it's not in other lists. I saw someone give a presentation, and they had the word English to Spanish, like towel, which is toalla. And I mean, that's from Arabic. It's definitively a cognate to me. I had used that in my study, and I talked to the person about it, and they're like, oh, interesting. So Matteo, what you bring up is real, man. We need to think about these things. What I also thought was interesting was the kind of like diacritics, right? Or the different characters you might find in anything from like accent marks to like tildes across these languages. The literature, at least that I know of, or that I understand, is not at all clear on how to score those with respect to an edit distance. So the measure we used, I think, was like if you added an accent mark, you got a Levenshtein distance of 0.5. But that's just our own intuition, and we might be able to work out some sort of internal validity, but we don't have that tested. And so that's actually an area, if you're interested in, that I'm sure could use some good research in.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the questions.
So we are running a little bit low on time. We're going to be transitioning to our informal student session in just a few moments. And I know that some of the students have some questions for you, but are there any of the instructors or faculty who have any questions for David before I dismiss you and we go to the student session?
I'll ask a super quick one if I can, Scott.
Yeah, sure.
Hi. So I'm actually building on so you mentioned, answering to Matteo, something about proficiency, but then I was wondering, based on what you were saying to Scott, what from your results suggests to you that proficiency about the Spanish would have any kind of effect, right? Because you could imagine, given your experimental design, that all you are getting is just symbolic priming, right? So if you take somebody that doesn't know Spanish at all, they might get the same speed up in recall time, or maybe you have a control for that, and that would be cool. But so that it's just a speculation question, right? Since you measure proficiency, I was wondering whether there is something already in your results that suggests that proficiency in Spanish helps or not, because I would have guessed, yeah, maybe it's just orthographic differences, then it doesn't matter whether you speak Spanish or not.
Yeah, so and think about this for a second. So I guess the idea is, can you use your second language, right, as a helper here? And we could set up another experiment in which we looked at like novice learners, intermediate learners, and advanced learners. And then we would see, we could compare the differences like between the groups. I would expect the advanced learners, given my knowledge of just cognitive psychology and like expert learners, not to like go to Malcolm Gladwell's like 10,000 rule thing, but it affects how you look at something and then how you process that something, probably based because of how you have that something represented in your head. So I would hypothesize that while the novice learners were only seeing an orthographic or a kind of a form effect, the intermediate learners who do have years of language experience, over 500 hours of language instruction, over 600 hours of language instruction, I think they would be able to use those. And then I think someone that knows the language even more and knows more words, for instance, would have that effect would increase. That would be my hypothesis, at least.
Right. I mean, that's a good hypothesis, right? It would be interesting to check because I don't do lexical psychology, but my naive impression, since we know that this kind of symbolic priming effects are very easy to get in recall times, would be that maybe it's just that, right? And so, yeah, it would be cool to be able to see whether there is an actual language effect underlyingly or not.
Yeah. What comes to mind, just to close, is a previous study we looked at was English to Spanish, and we used masked priming. So we're hiding the prime in about a 50 millisecond SOA, or synchronous onset, stimulus onset asynchrony. And we looked at novice learners, intermediate, and advanced learners of Spanish, and then we primed them in English to see if they could use their English prime. They should know English really well, right? And what was really interesting, this is why you might be onto something, is that what correlated really well with the mass prime was spelling ability. So if you paid attention to like the form, for instance, like that mass prime meant a lot to you. And so, yeah, you might be onto something there with the kind of like form overlap. I think what's going on here is a combination of form and meaning, and that's why they're able to perform much better on the cognate set as opposed to the non-cognate set. But I mean, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Aniela, for that question. Good. So we're going to go ahead and transition into the informal student session now. Those of you who will be, so I'm going to dismiss the faculty and instructors and staff at this point, but let's give David a hand, either a virtual one or an actual one before you leave. Thank you so much, David. This was very interesting. Important things to think about.
Thank you all so much. I'm very grateful to present for you. And if you have any follow-up questions, just please let me know. Hopefully that contact information came through. And if not, I can put it into the chat. I'm happy to help out with anything I can. And just please take care.